Okay. All right, so I'm going to tell you about this book that I've just written. It's about the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was published was written and given to the cabinet and accepted by the British cabinet on the 2nd of November, 1917. In the Balfour Declaration, Great Britain promised to support establishment of a national home for the Jews in Palestine. And as Jackie said, today the Balfour Declaration is seen by some as the foundation stone of modern Israel and therefore something to be celebrated. It is seen by others as a first step in Arab dispossession and misery, and therefore as something to be deplored. But everybody has viewed it as an inevitable byproduct of a growing Anglo-Zionist intimacy during World War I. And every previous book, to my knowledge, about the Declaration celebrates the remarkable campaign led by a Zionist leader in Great Britain, the Russian-born chemist Chaim Weizmann. And they celebrate how he taught the principles of his movement, Zionism, to the British political elite. Well, I don't in any way discount Weizmann's extraordinary qualities and talents. He was indeed one in 10 million. Nevertheless, my book emphasizes not the inevitability of Weizmann's triumph, but its contingency. As I came to understand, the Balfour Declaration nearly didn't happen. Moreover, it was not written in stone. Even after its publication, the British Prime Minister, whose name was David Lloyd George, was prepared to finesse the Declaration under certain circumstances, as I will be explaining this evening. So now let me figure out how this works. There we go. 1914, the Middle East. Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, whose capital, of course, was Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire included most of the Middle East, which is to say Mesopotamia, which we now call Iraq, and Syria, including Lebanon and Palestine in those days, the Arabian Peninsula, and Egypt, although ostensibly under Ottoman control, in fact, since 1883, really had been under British control. Now, the Ottoman Empire was ruled by a revolutionary party that had seized power in 1908, and which was called the Committee of Union and Progress. This revolutionary regime had really taken the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and made him into their puppet. The Sultan, by the way, was also the Caliph of Islam, which is to say the most important figure in the Islamic religion. Now, I want to mention also that in 1914, before World War I began, Great Britain had Middle Eastern interests, significant Middle Eastern interests, because it controlled the Suez Canal and depended upon maintaining control of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was really Great Britain's economic windpipe. They could never allow another country to jeopardize their control of the canal. Also, France had economic interests in the Middle East, especially in Syria and Lebanon, and also along, you can't see it on the map, but also along the coast of North Africa. Now, in 1914, before the war began, the ruler of the Hejaz, which today would be considered, I guess, the westernmost portion of Saudi Arabia, was called the Grand Sharif Hussein. This man. The Grand Sharif Hussein was a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, and in fact, only direct descendants, and there were two branches of the family, could occupy this position. The Grand Sharif Hussein was an extremely important figure in the Muslim world because the Hejaz included within it the two most holy Islamic cities, Mecca and Medina. And then also, of course, he's an important figure in the Islamic world because of his heritage as a descendant of the Prophet. Now, the Grand Sharif Hussein nurtured ambitions in 1914. He was already thinking, probably, about establishing himself as the hereditary ruler of an independent country. Certainly, he wanted, at the least, much more autonomy within the Ottoman Empire. He was not the only Arab nationalist in the world in 1914 by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, various groups situated throughout the Middle East were already talking about autonomy or possibly even independence. The first Arab Nationalist Congress met in Paris in 1913. That same year, 1913, the Sharif Hussein sent his son, Abdullah, his second son, but the one he depended upon most at this point, to meet with British officials in Egypt. And Abdullah did so. He spoke with the British Consul General, Horatio Kitchener, an extraordinary figure, and also with Kitchener's Oriental secretary, a younger man named Sir Ronald Storrs, this figure. And what did Abdullah want? And the answer is he wanted machine guns. He wanted to know if Britain would support his father in a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. The British turned him down, explaining to him that they wanted to maintain friendly relations with the Ottoman Empire. But then, of course, World War I began. Britain feared, quite correctly, that the Ottoman Empire would side with the Germans. And then what would happen? Well, they feared that British Muslim subjects living in Egypt and in the Sudan, and above all in South Asia, in India and present-day Pakistan, would heed the call of the Ottoman Sultan, who was also the Caliph, and who would demand that they wage holy war against Turkey's enemies, that they would wage a jihad. And then they recalled their pre-war conversations with Abdullah, and they rethought their position. Perhaps they would support a rebellion against the Ottomans after all. And what they were thinking was that the Grand Sharif Hussein of Mecca and Medina, such an important figure in the Islamic world, would blunt the call for jihad of the Caliph in Constantinople. In fact, they thought more than that. They tried to figure out how they could win over the Grand Sharif Hussein, and Kitchener had Storrs inquire, we will support you if you rebel. Would you like to reconsider? And if you do, we could even think about your replacing the Sultan as Caliph of Islam. Thus began a fateful correspondence. It was carried on between emissaries of the British Empire and the Grand Sharif Hussein. Now, Kitchener, when the war broke out, happened to be in London, and he was soon appointed Secretary of War. He did not go back to Egypt. He was replaced by this man, Sir Henry McMahon. And McMahon conducted the correspondence with Hussein. This is one of the most infamous correspondences in history.